Hello, Henk.
Hello.
Great. Can you put the video on, please? So we can all see you. Can you hear me, see us? How's this?
I can hear you.
Great. Could you put the video on, please? Great. Yes, now we can see you. Yes, excellent. Great. Hello. Thank you very much for taking the time, and I'm very excited that you can be with us in theory for a little bit. And actually it was you and Diederik who inspired me to do this workshop, to start this research, so I'm extremely grateful for all the help, support you've extended. And I'm now opening the floor for you to address the group.
Thank you very much, Professor Smit, for the invitation to be with you. Unfortunately, we cannot be with you because of, obviously, the distance, but we appreciate and we also value your conference as being important also in our journey towards what we say water and cultural heritage. As you know, we started in 2012, in particular Sir Diederik Six, to bring the cultural heritage, water-related, onto the international agenda. So far, unfortunately, cultural heritage hardly features in international debates and also at the local level as an input as significant for planning and also policy development. It's rather by water professionals seen as, maybe you can say, a little bit cynical, maybe solidified pride or a cost to planning exercises, planning and water challenges, rather than bringing something additional value. Now, just to introduce myself, my name is Henk Van Eyck. I'm Ambassador Water and Heritage of ICOMOS Netherlands since 2012. And as I already indicated, I'm working together with Dr. Sir Diederik Six, who is a restoration architect. My background is water engineering. I started off in rural water supply in the 1970s, the early 1970s. And then I became an advisor, policy advisor for the Netherlands government in the 90s. And during that time, in 1997, I happened to meet Anil Agarwal. And Anil Agarwal, maybe you know him, an Indian archaeologist, I believe. He wrote a book called Dying Wisdom. I show you the book. For me, I don't know if you can see it, but this book, Dying Wisdom, for me was the first encounter with the importance of heritage. And the title says, Rise, Fall and Potential of India's Traditional Water Harvesting Systems. It's about water harvesting. The topic very much also of importance for the ICID. And I believe that Dr. Sadaf Singh is with you. He must also know Anil Agarwal, and also Sunita Narain was also an editor of that book. So in 1997, meeting Anil, who was a very, unfortunately, he passed away, a very inspiring professional, it attracted my attention to the importance of water-related heritage, cultural heritage. Then, when I retired in 2012, I was asked by Dr. Diederik Six to join him as a restoration architect, and I believe your room is, there are quite a few restoration architects with you, and his request was, let's move together. I'm a restoration architect, you are a waterman, please let's make this water-related heritage of relevance for the water community. Let's go out to the water community. So at that time, it was a new theme, but it was not entirely new in 2012, because already in 2010, there was an interesting document prepared by UNESCO, and I'll show you again. This document titled World Heritage, and the subtitle is Water, Its Role in Human Evaluation. It's about Roman aqueducts, about paradise gardens, and about Dutch polders. And this document also presents, including quite a lot of Indian architecture. So this was 2010. And in the foreword, there is a foreword written by Professor Fakhri Hassan. He was an Egyptian, very instrumental to promote the importance of heritage. And the last sentence in his introductory is, the world's common water legacy and the ingenious technical and social solutions devised by our predecessors to cope with a scarcity of water must be considered as a tool for innovative approaches to shaping our common culture. Now, this relating heritage, cultural heritage, with future, with present and also future planning and design is a message which one hears quite often. We organized, say, in 2013, our first conference in Amsterdam, and the result of that conference is the book I'm showing you now. The title of the book is Water Heritage, Material, Conceptual, and Spiritual Connections. So it brings out the importance of not only the architecture, but also governance issues and also the spiritual elements. And this book also opens with a statement by the Secretary General at the time of UNESCO. That was Ms. Bukova. And she also relates the importance of heritage for today as an inspiration, as being significant for planning today and also in the future. Now, these statements one can find them quite often, but in reality, what we see is that, as I started out, this doesn't happen. Heritage is, again, by water people, not really taken into planning practices. And I'm very happy that only 2 weeks ago in the International Amsterdam Water Week, it was the first time that water and heritage was actually put on the agenda as a roundtable discussion. We failed to get the idea into the Stockholm Water Week, which was in August this year, and we are hoping now to have this theme also included in more water conferences in the international water debate. And why am I hopeful? Well, in the Amsterdam Water Week, the recognition was not only for the theme, because we offered a book. We presented a book in that conference. It's called Adaptive Strategies for Water Heritage. And you see the book here. It's the result of a conference last 2017. And the title says it all. It's about adaptation of water heritage for today and for tomorrow. This book was presented, and in addition, as I said, we also had this roundtable to discuss how to actually do it, how to adapt water-related cultural heritage for planning and for policy development. And that is something which is a challenge going to be taken up by an international scientific committee, an ICOMOS scientific committee. I'm sorry that there is nobody from ICOMOS in your meeting, because in 2017, December, ICOMOS had its General Assembly in Delhi, and also Dr. Sadaf Singh's predecessor and that was Avinash Tyagi from the ICID was at the meeting in Delhi, the General Assembly. So I'm sorry that ICOMOS is not there, but I believe you may have had contact with Nupur Prodi, who was a very outspoken and important co-organizer of that conference. She organized in Delhi a workshop on water-related heritage, and in particular step wells, but also fountains in cities, etc., still operating historical fountains, to show the importance of these structures and to actually promote these structures to be recognized. So we are working on this International Scientific Committee, and I hope also that somehow you can connect to that effort, which is going to be a worldwide effort, to relate this heritage for today and also the importance for today and tomorrow. And then an important other activity is next February in Tokyo, Japan, organized by Kenzo Hiroki, the water envoy of Japan. He is organizing a water and culture symposium. It's high level with UN representatives, even the former Prime Minister of Korea will be there, and Nupur will also be there. And the intention is that this conference is going to open the door towards a UN water debate on, again, water and culture. And if I may give it a title, what we are actually up for is to develop, one can say, a journey on water culture for today and tomorrow. And subtitles are, for example, valuing water culture, valuing it. That's very important. We have to convince by evidence that water culture is also valuable for tomorrow. And another title, which is coming from the UN, is there is a book just out. It's called Nature-Based Solutions. I'm thinking of, in the future, to have a book which is titled Culture-Based Solutions for Water. Now, this is like a sort of horizon from my perspective. Coming to your conference, I congratulate you because you've been working hard to bring the experts together. I know that, and we've had some contacts, and I'm impressed by the program. You start out with the traditional water systems and contemporary adaptations. This is a title which appeals, and I'm very much interested to also hear the outcome of, in particular, this session. How do you see the traditional water systems through adaptation become again relevant for, and that can be also in terms of cultural values, but maybe also in terms of supply to people, maybe for, domestic or for irrigation, or maybe even for spiritual functions, that could be as well, or ethical issues. And then, I see in the program Professor Langer-Gruber talking about nature-based solutions, really. It's about the ecosystems and the wetlands, very interesting. And then in the afternoon, I see, the topics of historic water architecture and water systems. I take it that most of the presenters are architects, so I expect that most of it will be on the material side, the beauty, ethical, the aesthetical. But I also see that Dr. Sadaf is speaking, and he will be especially talking about, I believe, the World Water Heritage Systems Program, which is about governance. So maybe you can have a discussion between the architects talking about the material and Dr. Sadaf talking about the governance, and maybe even discuss also how the water, the material and the conceptual can be connected to spiritual. So in conclusion, I would like to recommend your conference very much to also discuss you know, maybe in a sort of general discussion, more in detail, the connections between material, conceptual, and spiritual. And hopefully, you may come up with a sort of statement or, you know, a statement from your meeting, which can be an input into the Tokyo conference in February next year. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I wish you all success and beautiful excursions. And thank you very much for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Organizing a workshop and presenting was maybe a little over ambitious, but what I'm presenting here is really just an introduction to what I'm planning to do. The Center for Historic Houses will always have a research focus for 3 to 4 years. Normally 3 years, now I'm saying 4 years because the center is brand new, and especially if you start something, there is a lot of admin and, you know, just trying to gather information, putting things together, getting in touch with people and so forth. So India's floating palaces, I'm starting by, first of all, trying to find out the typology, coming up with a definition, and trying to narrow down the topic. Well, when I talk to people about lake palaces, they say, oh yes, there's one, Udaipur, and then it usually stops. They don't talk about anything else. And to be honest, you know, one building that fascinated me most before I came to India was the Lake Palace in Udaipur, because it's just too magical. This architecture, white, floating on the water with a mirror. It's like a dream. Sorry, can we turn the light off? No, my assistant is gone. This is my the chief. You know. Yes. So great. So there we have this. This is actually Jag Mandir. It is not Jag Nivas. It is in Udaipur, and there are a number of palaces. And it's just a really dreamlike image that is changing over time. So while I'm looking at lake palaces, I'm looking also at the themes associated with lake palaces. I'm looking at the iconography as far as the interiors are concerned. I'm looking at the position of the lake palace. And I'm also looking at the evolution of the lake palace through history, but also each and individual one. Because once they were built, they also started changing over time. How did they change? And the kind of subsequent lake palaces that were built, are they kind of referencing the older lake palaces? What is happening there? This is what I'm looking at. So here is really the kind of you know, the palace that we all know, Jag Nivas, that was completed in 1746. So the artificial lake was there much, much earlier. And I also find that someone dealing with historic houses, particularly palaces, I'm at times under attack when people say, well, why you are, you know, dealing with elite architecture when you could do slum intervention and so on. And I find it's always a little bit unfair to kind of pit the two against each other, because you know, I'm only thinking about a similar debate that was in the 18th century with the French Revolution, when revolutionaries actually decided to destroy you know, any architecture that was associated with the elites, and kind of getting rid of symbols, for instance, the fleur de lis, also associated with the royal family. And then Abbé Grégoire came along, and he wrote this text, which I find very, very convincing, where he said, well, there might be the elites, but there are also those who produced it, the craftsmen. And we are actually looking at human ingenuity. And we as humans have this right to develop our talent and to practice this and to celebrate this. And I think this is a very valid argument that I would also put forward now. And it's silly, like, I mean, if we have in Egypt the pyramids and we shouldn't look after them because they were built by the pharaohs and so on, it just doesn't make sense. So if we have these wonderful you know, structures that celebrate the highest level of craftsmanship and engineering, ingenuity and so on, we should have a duty also to look after them. So this is the palace. And why do people know it so well? Why is it the only lake palace that springs to mind? And I think there's one reason for it, apart from the fact that it's beautiful, but it is the fact that this was possibly the first palace that was transformed into a hotel by the Maharana of Udaipur after independence, who had this vision of, you know, he realized the kind of this old world was over, and he had to become a manager and an entrepreneur. And this started the movement of the, palace hotels. But as we heard before from Vibhuti, I totally agree, somehow there must be more to it. If you think about the hues of historic houses now, we can't only turn them into hotels. I think it's better than letting them crumble, but there must be other opportunities. And I think a lot of these opportunities could be found in the craft sector, because we don't necessarily always have to bring people there, but they can also be centers of production that they used to be in the past. Because of royal patronage, there were all sorts of craftsmen who produced beautiful objects. And if you think of a company like Jaipur Rugs, for instance, I think they've been extremely successful in empowering women in local communities in Rajasthan, because they are the breadwinners actually in the family. So it's almost like a matriarchal society now, not yet, but it's at least a very empowering force. And they can stay in the village; they don't have to move there, and they become economically successful. And I think sometimes the remote location of a palace is not necessarily an obstacle, but can also be used for something like that. But of course, there have to be many other strategies, and in involving the community. So, but number one. It is, if we think about why it is so well known, it is definitely this aspect of the hotel and tourism. So, and that brings me really to the topic of what are we going to do with these palaces? And if we look at about, I identified about 20 lake palaces, most of them are actually empty. So the question of what are we going to do with them is definitely a very prevalent one. So, here we have the images of the lake palace in Udaipur. And you see, I think the way it is kind of done, and of course, this is now, a totally new decoration, but I think it works and is inspired by this image of sensuality. And I think, what we heard before, these other kind of less material elements, such as water and the sacred, monsoon and love, poetry and love, and referring to the lake and the lake palaces in the context of love. There are some poems about this, and the miniature paintings, as these floating leisure palaces are certainly associated with them, and still used and kind of marketed by these hotels, such as the Taj Group now. And of course, other sources and well-known sources and well-known quote is this one by James Todd from the kind of early 19th century. Nothing but marble enters into their composition. Columns, baths, reservoirs, fountains, all are of this material, often inlaid with mosaics. And the uniformity pleasingly diversified by the light passing through glass of every hue. Here they listened to the tales of the bard, and slept off their noonday opiate amidst the cool breezes of the lake, wafting delicious odors from myriads of lotus flower which covered the surfaces of the water. The Sisodia princes and chieftains recreate during 2 generations, exchanging the din of arms for voluptuous inactivity. So here we have quite a lot of themes associated with Lake Palace, and this is just one paragraph. Of course, it is the actual practical, aspect of the lake palace, namely the reservoir. And again, people ask me, well, but this was only for the royal family, and I say no, because of course the lakes were there to benefit the other people as well who were living there. So it was not only for the local, for the royal family. Of course, the essential aspect of, the water, the colors, and especially this kind of image of light. And I find this is a really, really similar comparison to what was going on in Europe at the time. Because although we have 17th century lake palaces, for instance, of course, during the Mughal period as well, it was particularly this quality of the lake palaces created in the 18th century that is so striking and so unique about the Indian palaces that I call this kind of floating palaces. Because when I talked to another kind of friend, he said, oh, the lake palaces, well, every palace is a lake palace in Rajasthan. You see, so from one person saying, well, there's only the Udaipur Lake Palace, to another person saying every palace in Rajasthan is a lake palace. We must somehow find a kind of definition of what is a lake palace. So I'm referring to this type of, island palace in the middle, or someone that is using the aesthetics feature of being like a mirror element. And this is so much about the 18th century. Similar in Europe with the Maison de Plaisance, the pleasure palace that was created in gardens in the vicinity of the city as a very private place in combination with a garden paradise. And just to mention Frederick the Great's Sans Souci in Potsdam, it is this idea that he used, sans souci, without sorrow. It's this kind of idealized world where you forget everything, and where you create an idealized world very often associated with travel. And the Lake Palace, of course, is about travel. It's a miniature travel because you have to take a boat in order to get there. And if you think about the zenana and the kind of to be cut off from the world, even although the women were there again cut off, you have this expansive horizon and this openness, this quality of freedom that the lake offers. And I think playing with this idea of the mirror image, and again in the 18th century the mirror was very important as a manipulation of space, whether it was at the end of the enfilade, for instance, to enlarge it, or whether it was used, let's say the most famous use of mirrors was probably by Louis XIV in the famous Galerie des Glaces, the mirror gallery, where he also used it as control and as an illusion, because costume parties were very popular in the 18th century, and with this mirror image, you cannot know what is the real part and what is the light, the flickering candlelight, and what is the surreal part. But it was also used for control, because Louis XIV didn't need to turn around. He could see what the other people were doing and whether they were laughing, how they were behaving, and because Versailles was only about control. From the chairs, only he could use a chair, others could use a stool, the hierarchy, bringing the aristocracy to Versailles to control them. The mirrors played a role in this. And I think the element of studying the history of mirrors is a fascinating thing, because the water functions as a mirror as well. And we know from Jagnivas, for instance, that mirror elements were used in some of the interiors as well. And of course, it's typical, the Shish Mahal, for the women's quarters and for the bedroom, and to have this effect of the flickering light, like starlights almost, and to multiply the light as well. This combination again of practicality and the kind of illusion. But again, in this little paragraph, we have the reference of the lotus. So how can we have this mirroring effect, but also a lake covered with lotus? And I have just one image to give you an idea. So does anyone recognize this? Oh, I have it. Okay, yes. Yeah, right. Yes, this is Bundi Lake Palace, and you see it has these lotus flowers, but I think the beginning part closer to the Lake Palace is not covered with the lotus flowers. And of course, ultimately, with the mirror image of the building, you also have this reference of the mirror and the self. And I'm thinking, of course, of the story of Narcissus, and using the Lake Palace as a place of contemplation, the vita contemplativa, as well as the pleasure palace. And I have one example here of kind of to show you what was going on. So this gives us an idea of how it was used. So there was music, there was dancing, and here the Maharana is there, kind of here, if you see it, there as well. And this, can you see, this is filled with fish, stocked with fish. And I'll give you one other example. Here, used for swimming as well. It's kind of bobbing around. It's kind of almost a funny kind of image. Here, things going on here from the 19th century. So just to show you the diversity of these lake palace structures, I've put a few of them together. So here, of course, you recognize that. We have the kind of typical island lake palace that I had in mind. This is Dungapur, also surrounded by the lake. Here, this is an earlier example. You know this one? Yes, exactly. And this one is also, this is an Art Deco lake palace, which I think is totally fascinating, from 1933. And do you know what this one is? Yes, it's in Agartala. And unfortunately, see, someone who started out, only I've been in India for nearly 4 years, and you weren't there earlier. I know you've been here for a long time. You've achieved so much, and you know what the challenges are, the difficulties at time with the, working with the government and so on, getting the permissions. And one of the most difficult parts I came across was actually ownership of lake palaces. And there is constant kind of litigation. There's questions of inheritance. I mean, it's very, very difficult. And for instance. Yeah, I'll go to this. So this one was used by the government, but actually belongs to the royal family of Tripura, and they just recently won a lawsuit. So I felt, so what are you going to do with it? But I just don't get a response. They're busy with all sorts of other things. But you see, this is interesting. If you look at these two, kind of built at the same time, this I think 1930, this 1933, how different. One is a modernist kind of, version of a new lake palace, and this very, very clearly to me is a reference of Udaipur. And if you see the other buildings, and it's kind of bizarre that such a small state as Tripura, and Tripura state, has this immense building activity under this particular Maharaja, and this lake palace was part of it. So I'm really, really curious to see what will happen to this lake palace now. And it hasn't, Tripura hasn't been developed as a place of tourism. I think something like this could be a huge potential to bring kind of more prosperity to the region. And if you think of Jodhpur, a few years ago there was only Udaipur. There wasn't really much, but now there are so many places, and it has been really developed and attracted so many people. So what I'm saying is sometimes the remote location is not necessarily an obstacle to develop something like this. This is a case of Alva. This is a different type of typology of lake palace because it is clearly a tank. It is, it is very different through the geometry of something that is like part of a step well. And so you have that kind of structure as well. And so let's have a look at the different types of kind of typologies of lake palace we can find. So this, again, is something of this typical island kind of lake palace. This one is Silicea Lake Palace, which is on top of a hill, which doesn't have at all this kind of mirror effect, and I think it doesn't have this, magical quality that the others have. But, if I look at lake palaces, I have to look at these as well. And I think there are crocodiles in the lake as well, which reminds me of the kind of fortification aspect of the lake palace, similar to a moated castle in Europe at the time. And this one that is associated with a kind of water tank or step well. So, at least these three types of typologies I think we can use for differentiation. And this is again the, Art Deco lake palace that on top of a hill. So these are three very interesting lake palaces that all kind of belong to the Maharaja of Alva, but they are all, these two at least are under litigation. This is Vijay Mandir Palace. It's totally empty. Another problem that you will find with looking at historic buildings in India that you all know is how to date them. Because quite different from Europe, where you have archives and many reference points of dating this, very often you know the architect. That's certainly not the case in India in these cases. So when I asked the owner, or so probable owner, he said this was a 19th century structure, but I've heard people calling something medieval, which I thought was a 19th century structure. So I really, I haven't visited them yet, so I'm just mapping these, and then I will look at them, look at the interiors as well. I've never seen the interiors of the Buddha Palace. I think you've done the documentation for intact, yeah?
Yeah, I did the main city. This is outside the city.
So you have been inside the
I've been there also.
So are there any walking keys inside?
I don't know about this one.
You know it. Yes.
There is a lock piece with Alvar. There is an inheritance problem.
Yeah,
that is in the same one.
Yeah.
This is only bought by the artist.
But this is again under litigation too. This one also. Yeah. And I contacted the person who owns this Hati Palace in Pune, and he was just very aggressive to me on the phone and very, he just thought I was maybe had something to do with Maharaja. So sometimes you have, you just innocently call someone and you end up losing your trouble. Yeah. So yeah. And now of course the task is to see what is the iconography relating to the lake palace? So Dipti Meyer has done some interesting work on Udaipur, such as the lotus, and of course with the idea of travel and cultural encounter is something I'm very interested in. So I really want to see, why is there this parallel between Europe, the Maison de Renaissance, and the end of fortified buildings and the palace structure happening at the same time in India? Was there a kind of exchange? I mean, clearly we know about so much exchange. What was really happening? And of course, glass. Glass probably came from Italy. So there were all sorts of things going on. I want to look at this kind of these objects in motion, also ideas in motion, for these kind of similar aesthetics. And then, so lotus flower, erotic, illusions and so on. This is a study that I want to do for all of these lake palaces. So I want to give you an example of where actually I grew up. In my home. This is where my grandparents took me very often on the weekend. It's a German thing on Sunday. There's sometimes also you go and visit a historic house, usually with a Bratwurst. I don't know, I'm not offended in this. But the Germans and their sausage, so you can't do anything about this. They just love it. So this was a Nestle Wohn, built originally in 1427, but what we see is actually a 16th century structure. And that's what I said. We have so many castles. They were built at one point, but of course they changed over time, depending on the different tastes and the going on. So this is a very, very simple kind of lake palace, and it's totally different from the Indian kind of lake palace. So this is really like it comes from this earlier Renaissance moat structure. And why was the moat used? It had several functions. Number one, you could stock fish in there. And it was interesting to me that I saw that again, and you remember the miniature painting where the Maharana was looking at the fish. But they were vegetarian, I thought, right? I don't know whether they were eating fish or whether it was just to eat the mosquitoes, maybe. Yeah? And sometimes the color scheme, of course, in India could also have a function, such as in the Bundi case, you have the blue, which is also mosquito repellent. Yeah? So sometimes, the aesthetics also has a practical quality. So to stock fish, that was one purpose. To use water in the case of fire, which was a very typical problem in Europe. And of course as a type of defense. So, but this, Renaissance structure is not what we see in these kind of floating islands in India, which are clearly part of these kind of pleasure palaces in Europe at the time. In Europe, the pleasure palaces with their gardens were the beginning of privacy. In the Indian case, this was probably quite different because of the family structure. But because marriages were arranged in Europe, the ruler could not marry out of love. So he had a second family, usually in these pleasure palaces, where they had a kind of invented worlds. You could have a mosque, a synagogue, a mosque using Christian elements as well to really show that all the religions are equal. You could have a Greek temple, an invented kind of Chinese tea pavilion, and very often India was also associated with China. Sometimes they didn't differentiate between Asian countries. But it seems to me that these kind of invented fairy tale worlds are associated with love and the fact that they couldn't live the life that they actually wanted. So these little garden paradises were an ideal world that they couldn't live. And I think there is a parallel with India. Although I think they couldn't live this kind of life, they probably brought their own lives. But they had so many, so they were kind of easier for them to So, and then of course there is the topic of the lake palaces and art. And one is the Indian miniature paintings, but I think we also have other interesting forms of lake palaces and art. And mainly this here in the British Raj, 19th century, she was actually usually a painter of botanical prints, but I think these paintings are very interesting in order to see what aspects are highlighted and so on. And this is Chicho is also really interesting because the Padma palace was built much, much later in the 19th century. So it seems to me that again, very similar with Europe. In the 19th century, you can suddenly have a Gothic castle, or like Neuschwanstein by King Ludwig of Bavaria and so on. Similar to, again, even like the Lake Palace in Tripura in the early 20th century, sometimes like a fairy tale with references of an older time that is happening there as well. Yes, so this is this, and so this is basically what I'm planning to do, looking at the historic evolution, mapping all the lake palaces. Here, this is one example of the historic evolution, right? So, see the quality, aesthetic quality is quite different. I mean, the red sandstone, and it doesn't have this kind of fairy-like playfulness. It looks more like a fortified building. And if you remember the Mestelbrunn example from Germany that I showed you, it's kind of similar to this almost, the Indian version of this, to the referenced kind of version of this one, in the 20th century or Art Deco. So here again, the combination between the revivalism and the modernism. So, and this is now an overview of some of the lake palaces that I have identified. So, Balsamand Lake Palace is a hotel. Belongs to the Maharaja of Jodhpur. Datia is no longer used. Deep Water Palace belongs to the royal family of Bharatpur, but is under ASI. And currently, the Maharaja of Bharatpur is the tourism minister of Rajasthan. And I think he has a great interest in developing it. Because unfortunately, the ASI is often an example of restoring it, but then leaving it. And I think this is something that needs to change, because these historic buildings need to make, they need a purpose, they need to make sense. Otherwise, there's really no justification only of conserving them and preserving them. Gardiner Lake Palace is managed by the Udaipur hotel group. It is a hotel at the moment. It used to be a hunting palace, pleasure palace. Govinga, I don't know. Jagnivas Udaipur, of course, is the lake palace. Jag Mandir is used by the family of royal family of Udaipur for restaurants and small weddings. Jag Mandir Kota is under ASI, is totally dead and empty. Jahaz Mahal is too old, of a monument to be used. Dal Mahal Nano, this is really interesting, it's actually in Haryana, or at the border. Nothing is happening there. Jal Mahal, kind of nothing is happening there, but it was actually planned to be used. Full Mahal Kishanga is a hotel. So you see, basically, it's either a hotel or it's not used, but there's nothing else. And I think, Rani Padmini, this is empty. Jodhpur, Sagar Lake Palace. Sardar Samand Lake Palace, Jodhpur. Silise Lake Palace belongs to the Maharaja of Alva, but is used by the government. It looks really so ugly. I mean, you can't believe it. I mean, you don't even want to go there. And the crocodiles are probably, not only the crocodiles are the threat to go there, but the interior design as well. Suk Mahal Bundi, empty. Uday Bilas Palace belongs to the royal family of Dungapur. It is a hotel, and it has a museum as well. So there's a plus, at least a museum, and members of the family are very interested in developing further historic buildings in Dungapur. I'm in touch with them. One of them is a trained economist, and he a consultant. So it would be really great to kind of develop some models, business models for the development of historic houses. And Vijay Mandir is under litigation. So this is the situation of lake palaces. I personally have not seen a study of lake palaces per se. I've seen individual studies of individual buildings, no kind of overall theme. And the question, what do you do with them now? What makes sense? And this is one of the main tasks of the Center for Historic Houses. And this is what I'm trying to do, is the Lake Palace Partnership. So I've seen some examples, really incredible examples of just a wall standing, and people did so much, they developed it into a house. I mean, incredible examples and wonderful restorations. But these are cases we don't know about. And I think we need to change that. We need to create a forum to put all of these historic houses together, not only Uber and Rana or this, but really a forum for all of these historic houses so that if you go somewhere, you know, I can stay there, I can have a conference there, I can have an exhibition there, I can organize a concert, or what have you. And this is what I'm trying to do with the Lake Palace Partnership. But in reality, it proves to be much harder than I originally thought because of the litigation issue. And quite honestly, when I approach people, not everyone is enthusiastic. Like, for instance, let's say, Near Mahel, one is a politician, is more interested in these things. I don't know. So I haven't really seen any kind of really spark or enthusiasm for this. So, of course, unless I have people who are enthusiastic about this, I cannot really, I can't really enthusiasm. It is a partnership. It needs both sides. So what does this partnership involve? Someone, as I said before, from Oxford University, my alma mater, Freudian slip, I'm collaborating with them. They have this very interesting knowledge transfer scheme, mainly to develop innovative schemes for historic houses. And the National Trust is a partner of them, and they are very interested in India, so it would be really lovely to continue this relationship here. So one of the things is clearly heritage interpretation, which I don't see in many of the museums, which are very sad, which is a very boring exhibition, peas in the glass cases, no information, no aesthetic aspect, no children's or studio, and all of this is missing. So I think, and there are individual people who are starting to do this, and which is exciting, but I think we really need to do this. We need to improve the visitor experience of these historic houses. And of course, education. And I think with the lake palaces, we have more than the historic houses, we have the environmental aspect as well. So this is something where we can do something for the community, teach them about water, water conservation, and things like that, and research as well. Organizing cultural events. We've been thinking about many of these, of course, with the lake palace in Jindal. And as I said, the crafts initiatives. So sometimes if the places are remote, I think it's a very good idea to use these centers to produce things that can then be sold and generate an income. Right. And of course, finally, the Lake Palace Partnership and the Center for Historic Houses is a platform for the owners of lake palaces, heritage experts, and the public. And I think, even this kind of workshop has been very helpful for me. It's really interesting to meet all of you, as I said, meet someone who can so many that I didn't know, and hear all the people working in lake palaces. It's really fantastic, and I think we need to work together, collaborate, because then we can achieve much more. Individual attempts will just disappear, so I think it's crucial to really collaborate. So this will be developed in the future. I'm trying to have a web page as well, so that all of these buildings are listed, and research is done on all of them. So I'm looking to raise money also for this, because we need to travel to all of these places, spread all of them around this time, and our time and so on.
Questions? Throw the floor open to questions. So do you want to please?
I mean, I don't know, not really a question, but maybe I didn't get it right. You are trying to attribute this as a 17th century phenomena in India, is that right?
Well, many of the lake palaces I've seen are there, but I think especially in the 18th century, this kind of floating palace that I'm describing, this typology.
Because there are several, like I think two examples you gave out earlier, like Mandu, then there's one in Sarkej, which is, I mean, as far, not the floating one, but the Sarkej one is in Ahmedabad. Then, I mean, there are ruins, but the palace is no longer there in the Bada Talao, Fatehpur Sikri. There's painting also of the lake palace of Akbar.
Right.
And Jal Mahal is also Akbar there. Which is, I think, it is also something, I mean, you may be right in a way of mirrors and this, I don't know. But a lot of it was bought by the Mughal sort of thing in Tramate.
Yes.
That, of course, is much more also of a criteria of putting it, because they are all very dry areas. So like in the middle of the lake, it will all be cooled by the winds.
Exactly.
So it's sort of, even the palaces, the way these, I mean, even this palace, it was not really this, but they had like the summer flows and the monsoon flows and the winter flows.
Right.
So these are the palaces were used as per the direction of the wind
Even
and the
inside,
climate.
even inside the water bodies. And
Yes.
sometimes you have a fan above the water body. That's in D, for instance. You can see this
Yes,
example.
yeah, but D is quite late. Those
It is.
particular
Yeah,
those
it is.
particular things that they got into D was little late. And in D is very interesting. A lot of it is actually from the robberies of from the Agra and Delhi forts that they were able to take. So there are like these palaces which are sort of assembled there, but they took it from Delhi and Agra. The other thing was the mirror thing is quite interesting. I thought that was. And you could also look at that Ram Bhaji guy who had his shipwreck in Belgium, Italy, and who comes back in 13 years after learning the mirror technique in Bhuj. And he creates the first Aina Mahal. And the mirrors are there still. It was very badly damaged. And supposedly he created this sort of the fashion of creating. In fact, the first neo-Gothic structure is also there in Bhuj. And in the Bombay, it comes much later in Bombay.
It's interesting to see how these ideas travel.
Yes. And I think at the same time, of course, there were a lot of foreign travelers who are also coming in. I mean, Shah Jahan himself is getting these jewelers and people working on his thing. So there was a lot of interest related to trade that is also coming. Interesting, but I mean, I could also add a lot of lake palaces on the list, but yes, indeed good that you could look at them as a different typology. Honestly, I don't know as a different typology, but yeah, the list can expand a lot.
Good, we must sit down.
Yeah, but not all are island palaces.
Yeah. So from the island palaces, there are also. And this, I think, is the particular magical quality.
So I was just thinking of going back to the first half of the panel, which was before lunch. So it shifts the register significantly. But I was just wondering that one of the things that came out of the previous discussion was, especially out of Rajiv's paper, was really about that can we think of the lake, right? And can we and I mean the lake palace is part of that lake, and if we separate the lake palace out from the lake itself. And I was wondering if you knew a little bit more about all the lakes that are there, and what's the status of all of these lakes. I mean, for example, what we saw, I mean,
Agartala, I heard, is still polluted.
So I'm sure that's what I'm saying. So, one of the ways to think about this, I was just thinking, is maybe to think of this platform in a slightly broader way, maybe. I mean, while the center can be an architectural typology, which you're extremely interested in, I think looking at both the flow of material culture, which they were talked about, and all of that. But I was just also thinking about the lakes themselves, and we saw a case when once all of that got done, the community got involved, the politicians got, all of that stopped. I think this, and real estate developed, and the city was actually intimately connected to it. So I was just wondering, maybe it might be interesting to expand it a bit more. This is just a kind of a thought to, to think of it as a total kind of a system rather than just a house.
I'm so surprised about this. I wouldn't believe.
So that,
just
thinking of Raji's.
Why wouldn't you get applause for it? I mean, I don't.
But you don't clearly. All you get are big pats for doing this stuff, right? And which is because I think there is. I mean.
No, in Europe you would get the Opa Nostra prize.
Or a prize from NDTV. That's it.
NDTV is just that's carrying the. Right, so just as a thought.
I think that's an interesting question, whether the lake and the palace are designed as a combined as one scheme.
Often they were not.
No, I think palaces have come much later.
Exactly.
In many
like
cases,
Udaipur, the lakes was there much earlier.
Yeah, because you see, it's not only about the lake, it's also about the catchment area.
Yes.
Exactly.
Right.
So because in the case of Jalna and Jaipur, it was one scheme. The walk out of
kinds.
Yeah, that was a different kind. Otherwise, for
So
instance,
there might
Barcelona.
be different kinds of lake palaces.
Yes,
exactly. Like,
for instance, Barcelona you're talking about, that's actually on an embankment. So that embankment was built much earlier, and this palace came up much later.
Yeah, but this kind of island palace is really this idea of the pleasure palace architecture. This is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Because Barcelona, I mean, as the legend has it, was for Zubeda.
Also the same story that you were telling about in your, like his concubine.
Concubine,
whatever.
What concubine is, but that was the queen out of love, married out of love.
Yeah.
Not
That's exactly what I needed to hear. Just the workshop is worth just for this years.
But a lot of people, I think Bundi also, a lot of them were also
So
like
it's
that.
similar. So why in the parallels is striking to me, isn't it? Really.
But I mean, there are palaces on the lake sides, and from the 6th century, if you look at Badami, there are palaces. So it's.
Or Jodhpur, I don't know. As I said, and I need to visit these places because unless I haven't been there and understood how this works and so on, at the moment it's only theoretical because I haven't visited.
And also you touched upon this, this is connected, the idea of taking nature inside the room is very much a part of how the Indians are handled, like Badal Mahal, where you have this room full of clouds, getting with badals inside, getting the monsoon almost inside, it's raining all the time, so perfect place to spend your night in a summer night in.
Right.
And the Shishman, the idea of the starry night.
Yes.
And so you have lots of these examples where the interior and exterior have blurred boundaries.
Exactly.
And whether the lake palace can be seen as that, where the water and the earth, the rain, and everything is kind of merging.
And the association with love, because monsoon of course is associated with love. And indeed we have this thunder machine.
Thunder machine.
Yes.
Now it's not working.
This is all really fascinating stuff, but I must go there, I must bring documents and see this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.